Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paweł Lewicki. I'm the Associate Director of the European Studies Center at Pitt. It is my great pleasure to welcome you again in our spring virtual lecture series, Europe Today. Our guest today is Professor Milada Vachudova. Milada is a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is part of core team of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey on the position of political parties across Europe. She served as the chair of the curriculum in global studies at UNC from 2014 till 2019. Professor Milada Vachudova specializes in European politics, political change in post-communist Europe, the European Union, and the impact of international actors on domestic politics. Her recent article explores the trajectories of European states amidst a strengthening of ethnopopulism and democratic backsliding, and how these changes are impacting party systems and the European Union. Her book, Europe Undivided, Democracy, Leverage, and Integration After Communism, was awarded the Stein-Rokkan Prize for Comparative Social Sciences, Science Research. Milada has held fellowships from the National Council of Eurasian and East European Research, the European University Institute, the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, the National Science Foundation, and many others. The title of Milada's talk today is Ethnopopulism and Authoritarian Role in European Union. Now, in her talk, Professor Vachudova will explore how the rise in support of populist parties has shaped party systems in Europe over the last decade, focusing on ethnopopulist parties, parties that make strong anti-pluralist appeals, vilifying individuals, groups, and institutions labeled as culturally harmful. When in power, ethnopopulist parties use these appeals to justify the concentration of power. And this playbook has helped bringing authoritarian rule to Hungary and Poland, while Poland stands on the brink.
Let's hold it back.
Thank you. She unpacks why ethnopopulism has become a challenge to liberal democracy in Europe, how oppositions have responded, and why EU member governments have shown such complacency and cynicism in countering it. This has led to the risk of decoupling of the EU from the regime of liberal democracy. Yet Russia's war against Ukraine is challenging political contestation related to liberal democracy and to relation with Russia in key states, including Poland and Germany. Professor Vachudova will reflect on Ukraine's challenge to the European Union and whether and how the EU enlargement process can be revived as a tool of EU foreign policies. Professor Vachudova will talk for around 45 minutes. You have the opportunity to ask questions in the little box below you in Zoom, Q&A box. Please do so. I will include these questions in our Q&A round after Professor Vachudova's talk. Now, we're staying in a triangle of so last week, Professor Micinski was talking about a triangle between migration, state, and Europeanization. Now we're, I think, talking about ethnopopulism, state, and Europeanization. Milada, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pavel. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I will try to speak only for 25, 30 minutes, never easy, but I'm excited to have a discussion and answer questions, because some of the questions that, the tenor of European politics really has been transformed over this last year owing to Russia's war against Ukraine. And, Ukraine stands, this terrible war against Ukraine stands to have some positive impacts for European politics and European integration. So we'll talk about those. foregrounding, though, the fact that these changes are at the expense of Ukrainian civilians who are still being killed every single day, and Ukrainian cities are being destroyed. When Ukrainians say we're fighting for Europe, I think I agree, they are fighting for Europe. So we'll get to that part. First, I'll share my screen, and I want to say that this talk is based on my article in the American Review of Political Science. And so you can find that article, and maybe we can link it in the Q&A, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's open access. And so these charts that I'm going to be showing you are all there, and they're open access, and you can look them up, you can download them in various forms. It's a very user-friendly place to publish an article, especially one that I think is also really helpful for teaching. So let me share my screen.
Milada, just to quickly say this, you can post it in chat, I think, the links.
Okay. Let's see how able I am to do all those things at once. Okay, can you see my screen, Pavel? Yeah, okay, perfect. So let me start quickly going over a little bit of background. I became interested in the study of populism about the same time that many of us did, trying to puzzle out what was happening after 2010. First, it was just Viktor Orban, right? And we thought, well, I didn't think, but some people said, well, this is an isolated case. But pretty soon we started to see a surge in populism around the world. And I think as scholars of comparative political change, it's really important to step back for a moment and think about, well, what is this populism? Because so often today in journalists, in newspaper articles, but also in scholarly articles, populism is now just used to be synonymous with with ethnopopulism, with political parties and political leaders that vilify marginalized groups, that have this us versus them mentality with a hard other, and then go on to attack democratic institutions. But populism itself is not all that, right? Populism, the work of Kasmuda and others, Paul Taggart has an excellent book, describing kind of populism. It's simply the promise to defend people against establishment elites. And all populists, as I have on my slides, argue that elites are protecting and expanding their own privileges at the expense of ordinary people. There's a bit of populism in just about any politician in the world, just about, I would think. And then when we look at the impact on political change and on political party systems and on regime type, I think we have to unpack and look at different varieties of populism and also look regionally. So my work is on Europe. If we were looking at Latin America, we would be coming to different conclusions about the intersection of varieties of populism and political outcomes. So remember, this is Europe. And, in Europe, we've seen populism on the left, economic left. And here the question is, when you're thinking about varieties of populism, who are the people that the populists are promising to defend? And who are the enemies of the people? What part of the establishment are they particularly singling out? So populists on the left, we're all familiar, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Syriza in Greece. It's the people who suffer because of austerity, neoliberal economic policies, income inequality, the 90%, and the enemy are the financial establishment, big banks. So those of you who watched President Biden's speech last night, there was a fair amount of what we might call populism on the economic left in that speech, right? Going after big business, the wealthy who don't pay their fair share of taxes, large companies who exploit our data. It actually came up a lot. But generally, populists on the economic left, and here I point to Syriza, Podemos in Spain, they have a very inclusive view of who are the people. They're not parsing like, oh, are you a minority? Then no, you're not a real Greek. Or are you from a marginalized group such as women or the LGBTQ community? So Muda and Kaltwasser have this great definition of inclusionary versus exclusionary view of the people. So when I meet a populist, this is the first question I ask. Do they have an inclusive or an exclusive view of who are these authentic people that deserve this new and higher level of representation that populists claim they're going to give? Now, populism on the cultural right. Really important that I'm talking about the cultural right here. I'm not talking about the economic right. We can get into that. But all of the populists that have caused us problems in terms of democratic backsliding in Europe, in the United States, are populists on the cultural right. So I call them ethnopopulists. And so here I'm following the definition of Professor Erin Jenny, who teaches at CEU, her 2018 article, but I also recommend she has a couple newer articles that are really great. So the people are cast as part of an ethnicity, culture, nation, religion, race, or even civilization that is under threat. If you read Viktor Orban's speeches, it is a constant drumbeat of these enemies out there in terms of international institutions, cosmopolitan elites, Muslims, sadly, and of course, George Soros behind every corner. When you think about regime type, like what kind of regime do we end up? Why do we have an authoritarian regime in Hungary right now? How did Viktor Orban make the case to the Hungarian voters, and not all of them, but just enough at key times, to kind of justify the democratic backsliding? And a really critical part of that is the profoundly majoritarian kind of core of ethnopopulism, where you're essentially saying, look, as long as 51% of the real people, the authentic, the real people, defined usually ethnically, culturally, religiously, agree upon something, well, then that's democracy. And tough luck for ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community, feminist women, whoever finds themselves on the outside of whatever he wants or whatever the ruler wants. Now, there's a very rich debate about this in the comparative politics literature, which I'm sure many of you have been part of and seen. Now, when we want to unpack, like, okay, how does this look like when we're using the Chapel Hill Expert Survey? So these are some of the charts that are available in different forms, but in the article that I was telling you about. And here, if you're not familiar with the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, what we do is we ask experts on the political parties in each country across all of Europe to put all the parties in the party systems to indicate their position on a whole host of policy issues and also ideological issues. And so in this chart across the bottom, you see the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric, which is a sort of stand-in for populism. And on the vertical axis, the salience of immigration rhetoric. Now, remember, this is just the salience. But it helps you see, right, that here Fidesz, for example, in Hungary, or PiS and Konfederacja in Poland, and look at Jobbik there, who's been kicked out of the extreme right neighborhood by Fidesz. They have extremely anti-establishment positions, and the salience of immigration is very high. Now, we know that in Hungary and Poland, this is because of this so much during and after the refugee crisis, so many appeals about the threat of dark-skinned and Muslim immigrants coming into the country. Let's look at a couple other party systems. Here we have Austria and Italy. So this is from 2019. The Chapel Hill Expert Survey team is gearing up for another massive survey soon. And so some of you may get that in your inbox, and we're always incredibly grateful to everyone who responds. Here you see in 2019 in Austria, the Ethnopopulist Party, the FPO, and over in Italy, you see the Lega and Brothers of Italy, essentially the parties that are running the country today. Now, the Five-Star Movement is in a bit different position, right? The Five-Star Movement, very populist, but not really an inclusive or an exclusive view of the people, kind of in the middle. And so you can see that the salience of immigration is not the same for them. They were kind of more middle ground. So why use the term ethnopopulism? I think many ask that, do we really need a different term? And fair enough, right? But here's my explanation. So first of all, ethnopopulism isn't just about the appeals that politicians and parties make to win power. It's also a way to justify the concentration of power, justify backsliding once you do win office. And it's profoundly different from ethnic nationalism. So here I really want to pause for a moment and make the case. I wrote a lot about ethnic nationalists in Central Europe in the 1990s and how they positioned, former communists and others positioned themselves as ethnic nationalists. But the thing about ethnic nationalists is that the enemy of the people of the nation is almost always adjoining and intermingled nations, right? So for the Slovaks, let's use the Slovaks, the Slovak ethnic nationalists, Mečiar and all of them, the enemy is the Hungarians first and foremost, and the Czechs, probably the Germans too, certainly Hungarian minorities within Slovakia. So adjoining and intermingled nations that are considered to be a cultural or civilizational threat. But for ethnopopulists, that's not the case. For ethnopopulists, the threat is out there further. It's cosmopolitan transnational elites, it's international institutions, it's the EU and George Soros that wants to bring 1 million Muslims into Europe every year in order to destroy European civilization. This is what Viktor Orban campaigned on in the most recent, not the most recent elections, but about the ones previous. And ethnopopulism gives them enormous flexibility in terms of who are the people, who are the enemies of the people, and who are the friends. And it allows them to cooperate. And so one of the things which has been just frightening, I would say, has been the potential, right, that these ethnopopulist parties in power could cooperate in meaningful ways and derail European integration and change the nature of the European Union. And we have certainly seen that as Hungary has avoided sanction for democratic backsliding, and Poland has helped it, and vice versa. Today we have Italy in the game, and we have Viktor Orban trying to get Serbia in under an authoritarian regime. So this kind of flexibility and moving away from ethnic nationalism has been strategically very useful for them. There was a great cartoon in Slovakia about a neo-fascist far-right activist who's lying on the couch in his psychologist's office and saying, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm all of a sudden having warm feelings about Hungarians, right? Because now there's these common enemies with ethnic nationalism in the rearview mirror. The last one I talked about the flexibility of us versus them. The last thing I want to mention is that the economic policies of these ethnopopulist parties are increasingly on the left. Now, obviously, there's variation here. There's variation between Law and Justice in Poland and the Freedom Party in Austria, or the current Tory party in the UK, which I would argue has also been deeply ethnopopulist, especially under Boris Johnson. But if you look at, say, Poland and Hungary, these ethnopopulist parties are just not on the right. That good old, left-right about economic redistribution, about taxation and spending, that's just not where political competition lies, and that's certainly not the position of these parties. We still gather in the Chapel Hill Expert Survey like a general left and right, but we don't use it. We really don't think it tells you anything anymore. So this is how we break it down. On the bottom axis, we have the left-right economic position. So here we're talking about that traditional left-right to do with economic redistribution, the role of the state in the market, taxation and spending. And on the vertical axis is what we somewhat awkwardly call Tangal. So traditional authoritarian nationalist and to green, alternative, and libertarian. And so here you can see in Poland also change over time. The first box is 2010, the second is 2019. If it's round, they're pro-EU, and if it's a triangle, they're anti-EU. So here you see the Large Injustice Party has never been on the economic right. Konfederacja here is. And you also see, right, that when you have that coalition of parties against law and justice, you have parties coming together as sort of the democratic parties that represent all parts of the economic left and right political spectrum. So that's interesting to me. Hungary, similar, right? Fidesz, it's been a long time since Viktor Orban was a center-right kind of libertarian politician. And here you see Fidesz squarely on the left. And here you see our experts in 2010 still considered Fidesz to be a pro-EU party. By 2019, it's resolutely anti-EU. Okay, so I'm going to sum up this part of the talk and then move on to talking a little about the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine. So what can we say about the substance of competition? How have political party systems changed since we have this kind of rise of populism? So we see that when it comes to the substance of party competition and movement in terms of the substance, party systems with powerful ethnopopulist parties have seen the most substantial shifts, right? You have this very intense anti-establishment and anti-immigration appeals, intense majoritarian appeals, just like here in the United States, and the greatest policy changes. And what's also interesting is that the greatest policy changes have come in two countries where you had parties that were sort of mainstream right-wing parties got remodeled using ethnopopulism. So of course, Hungary and also the UK, right? This whole Brexit project where a small wing of the Tory party took over the Tory party, purged it of moderates, of pro-Europeans, etc., and pulled off Brexit, which has been incredibly consequential. Now we have a lot of evidence that it's a disaster, but it's a very consequential disaster for the UK and for Europe. And you see what I mentioned already, this polarization between two groups of parties. We just had elections in the Czech Republic. We're in the same place. We're on the good side. We got rid of our ethnopopulist, our Babiš and our Zeman in successive elections for parliament and president. But those elections, like in Poland and in Hungary, are now fought on what my co-author Courtney Blackington and I called a regime divide, where essentially you have the anti-democratic ethnopopulist bloc, and then all the other parties, whether they're center-right, center-left, whatever, they are all called sort of the opposing democratic parties. Kind of a back to 1989, right, where we had the communists versus Solidarity and the communists versus Civic Forum. Okay, so what happens when populists rule? Well, if you look at the 2010s, we don't have it's a very small n, okay? So, but generally speaking, left populist parties, when they make it into parliament in Greece, in Spain, when they make it into the government, they have tended to moderate their anti-establishment positions, shift towards stronger EU support or towards EU support, and seem to tend to become more ordinary parties so far. Now, ethnopopulists and party in power, we have no evidence. Maybe Italy, but before, I don't know. Maybe there are some experts here. But generally speaking, they have not been tempered by being in government. And there's a fair amount of political science theory that would predict that a party that's been kind of a niche party or a fringe party, if it gets into government and suddenly has to govern, it will moderate. But we have not seen that. We have not seen it in Austria with FPÖ. We have not seen it in Italy with Lega. And we certainly haven't seen it in Hungary or Poland with Fidesz and the Law and Justice Party. Now, what's dangerous about this? Well, we all lived through Berlusconi, so how is this different at the European level? Well, what seems to be different is this project, and Orban certainly has it, and the Poles, or the Law and Justice Party, of wanting to decouple the EU from liberal democracy. Have the EU be a collection of states. Whatever regime you have is up to you. But actually the EU that we have today, liberal democracy is an anchor of everything it does, especially the enlargement process. So my co-author Sophie Meunier and I have an article where we set that out. Okay, I think this is just to say, ethnopopulists have been remarkably resilient to hypocrisy, but I'm a little bit more optimistic now because the elections in the Czech Republic have shown that you can go too far in your absurdity and your hypocrisy, right? I mean, Babiš campaigned as the nice, normal, ordinary working class man next door, even though he was extremely rich and controls a great swath of the Czech economy. All of that kind of hypocrisy eventually did, I think, catch up with him. Now, some of the hypocrisy is downright maddening because some voters vote for these parties because they tell them that they're finally going to do something for those left behind, right? You've been left behind, we're going to help you. But the track record generally is once in power, they continue to pass legislation that favors the rich, their own inner circle, and they conflate liberal democracy with neoliberal economic policies. And it's been incredibly effective, and scholars do it, and it makes me upset when they do. The reason is, right, that there has been books and articles written and pundits have talked saying things like, East Central Europe has rejected liberalism. What does that mean, right? There's liberal democratic institutions over here, and there's neoliberal economic policies such as deregulation and lowering taxes and so forth that have boosted hugely inequality. But Viktor Orban and others have argued, well, in order to fix these things, you have to throw both of them out. And that's one of the ways in which Orban justifies democratic backsliding. Now, when we think about the response to Russia's war against Ukraine, we have really a kind of real-time laboratory where we have, as I'm sure you know, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, who is adamantly supporting Ukraine. And we have Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, who is very strongly not supporting Ukraine. And in fact, there's an interview with the Hungarian foreign minister today in a Serbian newspaper where he is directly arguing for continuing, if not increasing, imports of Russian energy to Hungary, having the Russians build more nuclear power plants in Hungary, and courting Serbia to come be a partner in that. So we have two types, right? Those using the strong support for Ukraine to recast their image. We have President Zelensky in London today, and this incredibly unpopular and domestically disastrous series of governments under Boris Johnson and now Rishi Sunak have both found great domestic and international purpose in helping Ukraine. And I celebrate it. Ukraine needs every bit of help. But you see how it's Rishi Sunak is having the best day of his premiership today, hosting Zelensky. What do I hope? And I'm going to end here. I hope that this is in some ways a durable wake-up call to European politics. There's no question it's been a temporary wake-up call, but hopefully it will become a durable one, helping to expose some of the hypocrisy of ethnopopulist parties, particularly the way in which they court other authoritarian regimes to help them out, to escape, to try to find other sources of investment and so forth, to be more independent from Western governments. Hungary is constantly courting investment from authoritarian friends. The support for the Kremlin, you probably know the story of Salvini from Lega in Italy, who showed up on the border of Poland to help Ukrainian refugees, to try to, erase some of the past where he had been so close to Putin. And he was met by the local Polish mayor, who was wearing a T-shirt with a photo of Salvini hugging Putin. So there's been a lot of trying to quickly distance oneself from the Kremlin, but hopefully that will also help discredit these parties at the ballot box. It's a little too early to know. But we have some hope, right, that this authoritarian bloc in the EU, the chances of it being durable and resilient and growing, it could be dimming, right? Ethnopopulists have been voted out of power in the Czech Republic recently, twice, in the parliament and the presidency, voted out in Slovenia. Fidesz did win another 5-year term, but those are not free and fair elections, right? Those do not express the free will of the Hungarian people. Italy, however, has voted a new set in. So these are domestic debates are critical, and they're not just critical, right? They're not just critical in countries with ethnopopulist leaders. They're also critical in countries like Germany and France and Italy, where there's been there was a long history of very close relations with the Kremlin for economic reasons. At least that was the explanation for them. But what we saw in Germany was Nord Stream and Russian energy pumping corruption directly into the CDU and the SPD. And so this process of shedding those very strong economic ties with a deeply corrupt, authoritarian, brutal, violent regime is only going to be good for German politics, but it's a slow and painful process right now. And finally, will the events of the past year resuscitate the EU enlargement process, which has been, sadly just moribund over the last year, 2 years, 10 years? How long has it been since we really felt like the EU enlargement process had that dynamic that it used to have, where countries were working hard to meet requirements and able to move through the process in an open and transparent way? North Macedonia, Montenegro, these are countries that should be much further along towards EU membership, if not already in the EU. So what we need, right, is a meritocratic pre-accession process, a robust process, right, where candidates once again feel that if they satisfy requirements, if they undertake these domestic reforms that they want to do anyway, for which there's a lot of domestic buy-in, they have the political certainty that they will be able to actually get into the EU and will not be blocked by either the EU having too many other things on its plate or being blocked by political maneuverings and various existing EU members bullying them and blocking them, which has been the case over the last 15 years or so. All right, I think I'll stop there. I just want to show one quick slide, which comes from my work on also protest against democratic backsliding. I'm fairly optimistic by nature. And so my co-author, Antoinetta Dimitrova, and also Courtney Blankington and Iulia Ionita, we were kind of looking across the region along with other scholars and thinking, well, yes, we have backsliding, but we're also seeing a tremendous response on the part of citizens in these countries. And that points to democratic strength, not weakness. And we did some surveys across the region, and many protesters are, they're sanguine about the chances of the government changing its policy tomorrow. But some of them feel, I think, justifiably proud that their protest movement helped bring down the government, for example, in the Czech Republic, helped elect democratic parties, whether of the left or the right. And across all the countries that we surveyed, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Poland, many protesters talked about their duty as citizens in a democratic polity to raise public awareness by showing that they care about the polity, they're going into the street to raise awareness. And here's my favorite protester. I've shown him before. This was in the Czech Republic a long time ago when things really did look very bad. And he's saying things are so bad that even the Czechs have started to pray, which is an allusion to the Czech secular nation. And there you have Jan Hus Power, which is our Protestant Czech nationalist mythical hero. All right, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to share it again. I have actually a lot more charts and figures that I could show, but so if you have questions about particular countries, I do have, as you can see, all kinds of charts and figures. All right, how do I do this? Here we go. All right.
Thank you, Milada. Thank you for these insights. Let me remind you that you have the opportunity to ask questions through a Q&A function in the in Zoom at the bottom of your window. Please do so if you like to. So I have, just to start the ball rolling, I have a question on Ukraine and ethnopopulism. I think the map of responses of ethnopopulist parties to the war is very different, and I think the case Poland and Hungary is a good example of that. Now, how does it look like in the West, so to speak? The what's the name of the current prime minister of Italy from Fratelli d'Italia?
Meloni, yeah.
Yeah, she is strictly against Putin. But I think in the other countries it's a different situation.
Yeah, I think we see quite a bit of variation, and it's a little bit too early to see how, whether parties like SPD in Germany will actually find their way back to a public position that really, for Germany to have strong economic ties with Russia is advantageous and needs to be restored quickly after the war is over. Certainly that sentiment exists in the SPD. It exists in the CDU as well. But I feel like that debate is slowly turning, and the realization that this was a mistake on the part of Germany, right? To become so intertwined in terms of its energy with the Kremlin. It's not an exaggeration, right, to say that the power, the economic and military power that Russia has today that allows it to prosecute this war is a direct result of decisions that were made, beginning about 15 years ago, to kind of neglect or ignore conveniently the nature of the Russian regime, and to sort of make the argument that through trade we can have peace, and through trade we might be able to change them. And here the United States has been very consistent in saying that this is a bad idea, don't do it. So I feel in Germany, it takes a while to sort of admit that this was a mistake in the first place, and then to say, well, as a result of our making this mistake, we now have to bear the costs. A little bit like what the Germans felt free to tell the Greeks after the financial crisis, right? You made a set of mistakes as a country, and now you need to carry the costs.
Yeah. Um, well, that's Germany is a particular case, I think, because there's a long history of exploitation of, various goods from Central and Eastern Europe, and also cheap energy that is extracted from Russia and used to produce highly processed goods and to export them all over the world. It's like a purely imperial history, or imperial policy. But I was wondering also, I recall an interview with a German leader of these demonstrations. I forgot their name right now. Montagsdemonstration, which are also, ethno-nationalist. And he claimed that the people that gather at these demonstrations, they have much more in common than with current Polish government than with our government in Berlin. And if you look at also at these hand-in-hand policies of Hungary and Poland, earlier Slovenia, of how certain things, narratives are reappearing in Russia, Brazil, in Poland and Hungary. I think the war in Ukraine stirred it up, stirred these connections quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that, but I also see, and again, a year ago, right? Everyone was expecting. I remember all of March, April. So first in February, most everyone thought Ukraine was going to fold, right? And once they realized it wasn't going to fold, then the next pundits, the Beltway shock jocks, said, well, this coalition is fragile. This Western coalition in support of Ukraine is fragile. And, it's actually not fragile. And the newest Eurobarometer shows increases in support among EU citizens for supporting Ukraine. And the pattern is quite interesting, right? Its support is very high where you would expect in the Baltic countries, in Poland, but it's also very high in Portugal. And it's generally very high across the EU, higher than predicted. And so to the extent that governments are sensitive to public opinion is not saying to them, we're tired of having high energy bills because of Ukraine. Now, they may be tired of high energy bills, but they're not telling their government, go back to being nice to Putin. We're not willing to bear these costs. So that's good news. I think it also shows a little bit of improvement in terms of leadership in a number of countries. And I think the nature of the war is so horrific and so brutal, and such a completely, there's not been a war with such moral clarity since World War II. And I think that is communicated, that has come through in no small part due to the efforts of President Zelensky and his staff.
Yeah. We have a question.
I think what I wanted to say, it's politically costly right now for political parties, even when they want to say, let's go back to business as usual with Putin. And especially we want to go back to getting money directly from Putin. These parties are all financed by the Russian government. The Czech president Zeman, the FPÖ in Austria, Lega in Italy. These are parties that get money directly from the Kremlin into the political party coffers. The Chapel Hill Expert Survey next month, we're going to do a little flash survey where we're specifically going to ask about the different parties in the party system and their views on helping Ukraine and sanctioning Russia.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience, Virginia Desilante. I hope I pronounced it in a proper way. Thank you for a very interesting talk. How do you think the EU can better work politically with the Orbans? I guess it's a universalization of that kind of regime.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is there's two baskets in my mind. So one basket is to say the problem is that the EU worked too well with the Orbans. the problem goes back to the European People's Party and the European Parliament, which was controlled by this Angela Merkel's CDU party. They wanted to remain the largest party in the European Parliament because that gives them power to do things like appoint the commissioner. And they needed Fidesz to do that. So for years and years and years and years and some more years, they turned a blind eye to what Viktor Orban was doing in Hungary. And it wasn't for people not warning them. So one of my colleagues, Dan Kellerman, for example, has written extensively. He also has a great Twitter feed. There's a Twitter feed by a group of scholars called I think the Good Lobby Profs. Here, I can type that in because what a great name. And they are trying and have been trying and continue to try to get the EU to not turn a blind eye and to really take a tough stand when it comes to the destruction of liberal democracy in member states. Now, the EU has limited tools to do that, but is finally starting to use them. So Poland has had money suspended, awaiting changes. They're working on doing that with Hungary as well. Now, there's still, from the point of view of this side, there's still too much compromise. These are kind of, Orban agrees to change some things to unblock the money. And remember, these regimes are in a way paid for by Brussels. The amount of money that the EU transfers directly into the hands of the government. And if you're an authoritarian government, you spend it however the heck you want. You give it to your brother-in-law. That's what happens in an authoritarian regime, right? There's no checks and balances. And so the EU for years, until very recently, just kept giving that money to Orban. So that's one side. The other side is working with them. So what do we want to work with them to accomplish? Supporting Ukraine. There are some issues where Viktor Orban, clearly, on the one hand, the Kremlin is asking him to veto EU policy, to scuttle EU foreign policy. And on the other hand, his European partners are saying, if you cross this line, then we really will do something, even more than what we've done. And so he threads that needle. But in the process does real damage to the ability of the EU to prosecute a united foreign policy. He has, for example, prevented the EU from sending a letter in opposition when the United States moved suddenly its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he did that on behalf of his friend in Jerusalem, Netanyahu. He's tried to stop investment screening for foreign investment from authoritarian regimes. He's tried to stop the EU enlargement process from focusing on things like independent civil society and independent media, because, of course, those things don't exist in Hungary. So it's a bargaining process. It's a co-optation process. And I think the EU kind of loses either way. If they work too much with him, as they have done, they're enabling him. If they try to take a very firm line, well, they're not able to do that. They don't have the unity to do that. But if they did, they do risk Hungary just kind of leaving the EU.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now a question popped up, so I'll give the voice to the audience. What about the pro-autocratization mobilization with regards to objections to Istanbul Convention or LGBTQ rights in the name of protecting traditional family values in some of these backsliding countries? Do you think it is as big of a danger to liberal democratic principles as much as the regimes led by backsliders?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. Thank you. Thank you for this question. There is a debate within the literature about what is democratic backsliding. And some scholars have argued that democratic backsliding is only when the incumbents, the government in power, attacks existing formal rules and formal institutions. So, gerrymandering, changing the rules for elections or for how parliament works, all of that. But other scholars, including myself, argue that it's not just about what the government does in terms of formal institutions, it's also how the government speaks and what they say. And as they take control of media and they use the state administration to pump out their propaganda, if part of their propaganda is marginalizing groups of people and vilifying them and saying that they are not authentic, they're not real Poles, they're enemies of the people, they're culturally harmful, all these terrible things that are said about marginalized groups such as the LGBTQ community or immigrants who are dark-skinned or Muslim, women who are too feminists or who wants to have control of their bodies. I think this is also democratic backsliding. I argue that, if you want to have equal protection under the law, once you have people who are appointed or elected government officials who are essentially saying that the citizens of this country are not worthy of equal protection under the law, you are already backsliding. And unfortunately, we know in this country that that kind of talk often does lead to those formal legal and institutional changes that are a direct attack on those groups. The thing is that they do usually, the reason I think ethnopopulists have become, you could have parties using ethnopopulist appeals to get elected. Some of my colleagues argue that this is more like Babiš, he goes around saying a lot of stuff, used to get elected. But when he was in power, he was more constrained by Czech institutions. And therefore, is the Czech Republic really a case of backsliding? But part of my argument is that because of the way in which he vilified groups and used the power of the state to benefit some and not others, that this was backsliding.
Okay, I have one question from the audience, and I have my own questions.
Okay.
But maybe if anyone from the audience would like to pose a question, please do so. Fascinating research. I'm wondering where corruption is in this argument. How does corrupt smooth the process of democratic backsliding? How do ethnopopulists legitimize their patronage networks' corrupt acts? I think you answered this partly already.
This is a great question. Thank you. Thank you, Didem. So listen, I'm going to say something, don't tweet. Well, maybe you should tweet. Everyone should tweet everything apparently. But here's what I think. These days, when I am confronted, when I'm interviewing or writing about a political party that's corrupt or politician that's corrupt, it's that combination of corruption and ethnopopulism that I am sort of very concerned about. And so in a way, just garden variety corruption, although we know it's terrible, that it undermines liberal democracy, it undermines civic participation, it undermines the way in which citizens interact with both the state administration, but also with the democratic regime that they're living in, undermines trust and well-being. It's still, to me, less worrying than when this corruption is combined with the ethnopopulism, right? And so I think it's right to say, look, we've had a lot of corruption. Bulgaria and Romania are a great example, right? Where in Bulgaria and Romania, there's been kind of a consistently large amount of corruption. And our protesters, when we asked them, they were really interesting, because what they said was like, we need to change institutions that have been in place since 1989. That basically our transition to democracy in 1989 left us with a system that allows all this corruption, and we need to go way back to 89 and change things. Whereas our protesters in Poland and the Czech Republic were saying, let's just get rid of this government and everything will be fine. And that's an interesting contrast, right? Seeing like the problems are really this incumbent government and what they're doing, as opposed to in other countries where there's this more endemic problem. That being said, as someone who studied the Czech Republic, there's so much corruption in the Czech Republic, and it's specifically those corrupt networks, that oligarchic power that brought us Babiš in the first place. So you could say in the Czech Republic, it was the corruption and the capture of secret police and that whole world. The oligarchs brought us ethnopopulism in the Czech Republic, although a maybe milder version. Whereas in Hungary, it was more the nationalism and the Orban's arguments about were always kind of on the right in terms of conservative and nationalist, brought us Orban, who then created his mafia state. I don't know if might be one way to think about it.
Thank you. I think I wanted to connect to a bit on the question of LGBT and the thing that you said at the end of on a positive note about civil society, and that's also what I observed in Poland. That despite the state being more and more suppressive, the civil society is very striking back, so to speak. And and if you look at the surveys, actually the acceptance for same-sex marriages is growing constantly and in recent years rapidly. So these restrictive policies actually fueled a counter, so to speak, movements. But I think, as far as I know, so my question is, I think do you think these populisms in Central and Eastern Europe, will they continue, if we take Poland, to strengthen the civil society or weaken it, as probably in Hungary, at least from what I heard from people from Hungary?
Oh, that's absolutely right. I think, that's one of the puzzles of political change. Like, this is why I'm fascinated in different political trajectories. I think what happened in Hungary is that it was such a rapid and well planned out takeover by Orban, that there was, of course, huge protests and civil society organization, but he was somehow kind of always one step ahead and able to repress and get around that. And also Hungary's, membership in the EU, some young people have left and so forth. Whereas you're right, in Poland, there has been this mobilization. And it's interesting, right? Because in the Czech Republic, the mobilization was almost entirely in defense of democratic institutions, because Babiš didn't really go out of his way to attack the LGBTQ community. He didn't say anything nice about them either, but this wasn't his focus. Whereas the protesters in Poland, and this is my student Courtney Blackington's work, there's those protesting more to protect democratic institutions, and others, more younger voters, out in the streets to protect LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and so forth. We know that when you have my colleague Conor O'Dwyer and also my colleague John Gold have both written about how in countries where the LGBT community is under attack, it does lead to more civil society, more dense organizations, more the LGBT community itself gets organized and they get to know each other and they do things together and they have a lot of allies who come join. And so it in some ways is a more can be, for some of the people they interviewed, a less lonely and more meaningful existence as an activist than, say, in the Czech Republic, where there's really nothing happening except, lately before Babiš was thrown out, a kind of sense of slow erosion of that. But that's, still doesn't help Serbia, right? Like in a place like Serbia where you do have tremendous mobilization, but it's still a terrible place to be a member of the LGBTQ community. Just like it's a terrible place to be a woman who wants the right to choose in Poland, right? I am optimistic. I think peace has overplayed its hand, and I think the next elections are going to go well. What do you think, Pavel?
I hope, but yeah, I don't know. I was wondering, are you planning or do you have research going on these issues, on the civil, on the active part or activization of civil society in these different countries?
Yeah, so we have a paper under review right now, where we have our data on the protesters in Bulgaria, Romania, Czech Republic, and Poland. And so hopefully the reviewers will be merciful, and that will be out, this year. Reviewer number 2, please. And then and then we're hoping if we can get funding to expand that project, because there's very little comparative surveys of protesters.
Okay.
And so we would like to do more.
That's a great, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that.
Yeah.
That's great research. Looking very much forward to the publication.
Yeah.
Thank you, Milada. Thank you very much for being with us today. We ran out of time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and Milada. And I hope to see you also next week. Next week, Kaya Schilde we're staying more or less in the topic of Ukraine. We'll talk about defense cooperation and the war in Ukraine. I hope to see you again soon, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Pavel. I hope to see you too. And if any of you have questions, I'm the only person with my name in the world, so feel free to find my email and send me a message. Okay, thank you so much, Pavel. Have a great evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.